Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Taman.
And welcome back to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, the podcast that asks interesting questions that don't have any answers with your host, Ben Siders. That's me. And the other guy is Kirk Taman.
That's Kirk, as in the captain of the Enterprise.
We are intellectual property lawyers and certified geeks practicing law in St. Louis, Missouri. You can find me, Ben, on Twitter at Benjamin Siders. You can find Kirk at KirkDMN. And you can find this podcast at LGG Pod. We are here for 2025 Public Domain Day.
Public Domain Day. We're finally doing an episode because we love doing the Public Domain Day episode.
An annual tradition we've been doing for 4 or 5 years now, yep. I think. We kind of fell into this pattern. It's convenient because, one, it's the start of a new season of this podcast. And two, as we've discussed before, all copyrighted works in the United States, at least, enter the public domain on January 1, regardless of when in their original year they were published. So if you publish on January 1...
yeah, you want to publish in January is basically the short answer.
It's kind of the opposite of having kids. You want to squeeze the kids out in December to get that tax break, but wait to publish everything until January.
This is kind of like the Oscar winning. When do you release it to be an Oscar contender? You know, you want to be published in January to get the longest possible copyright.
If you've tuned into this episode for the last couple of years, you know that we are sort of in the... I wouldn't quite say the pinnacle, but definitely the rising heights of Americana. Kirk and I were talking this morning. After World War I, we saw just a cultural renaissance really throughout the world, but in the United States, especially with the Roaring '20s. And we are now at the end of that decade, and all of these works from 1929 are entering the public domain, which is the last of the 1920s. And the stock market crash was that year, so we'll see if we see a shift in tone in some of the works that enter the public domain over the next couple of years. But for now, we are watching all kinds of stuff that a lot of you were forced to read against your will in high school, or in my case, in an English degree, enter the public domain. So we're going to talk about some of the more notable works, and you'll find this year there's sort of a theme of the stuff that came out this year has been reused over time, and this kind of gets to the Public Domain Day theme of why it's important for these things to, one, be preserved, and two, eventually be released back into the public domain.
Yeah, and this is a key one because this is, in my mind, the one where you're going to get the most things you recognize.
Yeah.
I think that's, we're suddenly hitting the stage as it is. These are the things we were all forced to read in high school, or if we weren't forced to read them, they were on the list we were forced to read something from.
Yes.
And so therefore, they're titles you recognize. A lot of times these are books you're going to know. They're things you're going to know. We're not quite, I think, into well-recognized movies yet.
Not quite,
but we're just pushing that envelope and getting sort of new stuff. We're also going to start seeing the first real introductions of characters. We talked about Mickey Mouse, last year, Winnie the Pooh. We're starting to really get into a lot of very major, still relevant characters are starting to hit their first appearances between now and sort of the next 10 years.
What's interesting, too, with the characters, we'll talk about this when we get further down the line here, because Popeye is entering the public domain. But you have this, we've also noticed that with the films, as we get into the talkies, you see more and more film adaptations of books that are now public domain. So we're going to be straddling the space where the Wizard of Oz book is public domain, but the film is not. So the character of Dorothy is public domain, but the Julie Garland portrayal is not. And we're going to see that play out over and over here.
And then actually, we may focus a little bit on it in the course of this discussion. This is the sort of new interesting play between public domain, which is, as these things are becoming more and more, relevant and stuff like that, what does it mean for a portion of the character to enter into the public domain versus a portion of the character not entering into the public domain? And quite frankly, is that even a tenable legal system?
And it's interesting because so far we've had that happen with Winnie the Pooh. It happened last year with Mickey Mouse. I mean, I don't know about you, Kirk, but I just saw all kinds of internet talk when Winnie the Pooh entered the public domain about how Disney is going to lose their mind when Mickey Mouse enters the public domain. You and I thought, but Mickey Mouse isn't really entering the public domain. Steamboat Willie is.
Yeah.
And how much money are they making off Steamboat Willie these days?
Yeah. And we have obviously seen an enormous amount of content featuring essentially Steamboat Willie come out to play, most of it being, B-rate horror movies. Yeah. Some of them actually looking kind of entertaining. But it's one of those things where I think what we've really seen is that there was a lot of sound and no fury, which I'm going to use that analogy on purpose because it gives us a nice segue into our first element of
our first novel is William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, possibly his most famous, I think.
I gotta say it's the most famous. Yeah, most people one now.
I read this in my 1920s course at Iowa when I was doing my English degree. It is a tough read, like a lot of stuff from this period is. And it's about like a post-Civil War family that's dealing with the changes in the country. And the most interesting thing to me is that there is a mentally disabled younger brother named Benji, and the story is really told from his point of view. And one of the enduring themes is that Benji is constantly longing for the past. So there's sort of this not very subtle implication that if you want the past to come back, you're an idiot.
But in this case, yeah, it's you just can't do it. It's an impossible sort of, ask and everything else. This is a book, I have to admit, this has shown up on reading lists repeatedly when I was in high school, and I had no interest whatsoever in ever getting this to be something to read, mostly from hearing other people talk about reading it and it being a slog to read.
It is. A lot of Faulkner's stuff is. I've read, I think Go Down Moses was Faulkner also. I read that one too. I don't know when that was published though, but yeah, this one is probably his best known. It's on Jeopardy all the time as a question. I love this one though because the title, The Sound and the Fury, is not his. He got that from Shakespeare. It comes from Macbeth.
Yep. And that's, as I said, all sound and no fury being sort of a phrase, that comes into there. It's interesting because, again, in my mind, the thing that's most interesting about this is it's a book almost everybody's heard of, that we've all encountered in conjunction with high school. We're really hitting that stage now in public domain where this is stuff we have all heard of because of, whatever we're sort of, standard American public education. I should be saying this for Americans listening to this. We obviously have an international, group of people listening to this.
We should say the law differs in other countries, too.
Yeah.
So this is all stuff entering the public domain in the United States. Your mileage may vary in other parts of the world. I just want to say as a footnote, The Sound and the Fury may be one of the greatest titles for a book ever.
It is
a great, great title. Make sure to go mine Shakespeare for more title ideas. Okay, the next one, Ernest Hemingway, A Farewell to Arms. I'm pretty sure I read this. I don't remember anything about it, though.
Yeah, now this is Hemingway's first one to enter public domain, right? I think it is.
It may be one of his earlier ones.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the, I think so. This is one of the many post-World War I Hemingway works. A lot of what he wrote was influenced by sort of the enduring trauma that veterans of World War I experienced. And this one, I do remember it was autobiographical. I just don't recall.
So, I didn't read Farewell to Arms, and I totally should have. We were required to read something by Hemingway, and I read A Sun Also Rises.
I read that one too, yeah.
Because that was the one fewer people chose, and there was a good reason fewer people chose that one. I really should have read Farewell to Arms.
Yes.
Because people said it was a much better book.
I read
this is more interesting.
For Whom the Bell Tolls, and what's the other one that's famous of his? Hills Like White Elephants, I think.
Maybe I don't remember the other one is.
Anyway, so we don't have much to say about that one, other than, again, it's a book you've definitely heard of.
Yep.
Again, a great title. The third one we've got Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. There's quite a few on the list. By the way, we got all this from, again, the Duke Center for the Study of the Public Domain has an excellent website that documents a lot of the most notable works. That's where this list came from, and we're just picking out some of the more interesting ones.
They also do some pretty good analysis of certain of the issues and stuff like that on it. They do a great job with it. It's a great resource, and you definitely should read it.
I've not read this one. I don't think I've read any Virginia Woolf.
I've never read any Virginia Woolf either.
But I like this one because this is the title, A Room of One's Own. That phrase has entered the popular vernacular as sort of indicating sort of an autonomous space for exercising your creative license or creative liberty. So you're going to see that theme play out over and over here, where these titles and themes are part of our everyday parlance, and you don't even know where it comes from. Number 4, this one is near and dear to Kirk's heart. Dashiell Hammett, The Maltese Falcon.
Yep, and that's I think the great thing about this is the Maltese Falcon is entering this. It's public domain. It is the creation of Sam Spade, the first sort of occurrence in conjunction with it. What's interesting about it is the Maltese Falcon is itself a base for the Sam Spade movies, which themselves have to do with copyright infringement and whether or not there is a character copyright. In many respects, Maltese Falcon is kind of the work that creates character copyright in its, I would say, modern form, because it's the one that's most litigated around the character of Sam Spade. Keep in mind that the Maltese Falcon is he a character?
Archetype.
And there's a real question as to, and this is where I think it's interesting to talk about the idea of characters emptying copyright and changes. There's court cases that say Sam Spade is not sufficiently delineated in the Maltese Falcon to be violated by a movie of him. Mm-hmm. But what does that mean for the copyright of Sam Spade that now the Maltese Falcon is in the public domain? I doubt we're going to have any issues actually come into that. He's an old enough character, not particularly interested. But it's an interesting, sort of dichotomy, because it's one of the few cases where we have them saying his character isn't sufficiently delineated. I believe it's in fact the only case. And it says that because he's literary and not movie.
You think about, we talk about Calvin and Hobbes sometimes, and Calvin and one of his imaginary characters is like a Sam Spade type 1920s film noir detective. He's just Sam Spade, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, every film noir detective in some respects is Sam Spade. It's also, I mean, I actually really enjoy the movie. I like Maltese Falcon as a movie. I've never read the book, but I really like the movie.
I kind of feel like I should now. Number 5, John Steinbeck, Cup of Gold. This one's notable because it is Steinbeck's first novel.
Yeah, so we're again, Nate, you haven't necessarily heard of this novel, but you have heard of John Steinbeck.
Yeah, and you know what's coming.
Yep.
The Great Depression novel, The Grapes of Wrath.
The Grapes of Wrath.
It's interesting to see sort of the baton being figuratively handed off here from Hemingway to Steinbeck as these eras transform. Number 8 is Patrick Hamilton. The book is called Rope. I'd never heard of this one. I looked it up. This one, it became a Hitchcock film in the 1940s. Not sure if any of you are familiar with it, but I thought this was interesting because Hamilton would also later write a play called Gaslight, which is the source of the modern term gaslighting.
Yep.
It's about a husband who tries to manipulate and control his wife to steal her money by constantly challenging her perception of her reality and trying to gaslight her into thinking that she should not believe her own senses.
It's actually a pretty cool play too. Is what it is, and I believe it's referenced by a number of other plays. I did when I was in college. I ended up doing tech, and I did a lot of like horror and sort of psychological thriller type genres. I enjoyed doing those as tech back. I did a lot of lighting, and Gaslight was one that came up. I never worked on it, but it was one that was people were always referencing Gaslight in conjunction with other psychological plays. Yeah. So I mean, it's a substantial play that's out there.
Number 9, Arthur Wesley Ween, the first English translation of All Quiet on the Western Front.
Again, you mentioned it with the original language version of it. We now see English translations.
Was it French originally?
I thought it was German, actually.
Was it German?
I'm wrong.
It could be.
But yeah, so I think we bump into all the questions you sort of get into around this of what does it mean that it's the English translation versus the one thing that is interesting to point about this, a translation is clearly a derivative work.
Yes,
well
expressly so in the Copyright
expressly
Act.
So. And so we do definitely have a different work at this point in time entering public domain, and that's, I think, an important note to keep in mind.
And it's typical. We get this question a lot with publishing, but it is typical that the foreign publisher that does the translation will also own the copyrights. Yep. It happens all the time. Okay, my remembering is off here. Number 10, E.B. White and James Thurber, Is Sex Necessary or Why You Feel the Way You Do? You've probably never heard of this. The book was written as a joke. It's was not meant to be a success. These authors were just looking around at how much sex talk was going on in the 1920s, which may sound weird, but believe it or not, the 1920s was a decade of substantial sexual liberation in the United States. But this is more notable because these authors. E.B. White, of course, wrote Stuart Little, Charlotte's Web, stuff like that.
A bunch of children's stories.
And James Thurber also would later write The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, The Battle of the Sexes, and The Catbird Seat, which is now entered parlance as a term meaning that you're in sort of the commanding position. So, again, we see these titles become shorthand for what the stories are about, to the point where we've all forgotten about the books.
Yeah, exactly. It's an interesting sort of thing. But then again, I think this one's notable for the authors. What we commented here, Steinbeck, E.B. White, these are authors that we're talking about their earliest works are starting to enter, but their famous one isn't
decades
quite
away
yet,
Okay, so that's all we've got for novels. For films, there's not as much this year, not like last year with Steamboat Willie, but there are a couple things here. A lot of them are dance themed, and I should say that before we sat down to record, Kirk and I looked at on the Duke Public Domain website. They have a short, 90-second video of some of these films and the dance numbers that are in them. This is sort of the rise of the musical era. We're just now getting into the talkies, but before the talkies, what's something easy to film where you don't have to synchronize anything is dance numbers and musicals. So.
And keep in mind, as we're talking about it, we've got Anything Goes is coming here. That major musical coming up here is not that far away, from its 100th anniversary, and we're going to potentially see that. So
we'll go through these pretty quickly. The first one is The Cocoa Nuts, which is a Marx Brothers film. A lot of dance numbers in there. I haven't seen that one. Have you?
I can't remember if I have or not. I don't remember it to the extent I had. I recognize the name, but
yeah. But we're kind of getting out of the era that we know a lot in. The Broadway Melody, have not seen that one either, but this was the first one to win, the first sound film that won the Academy Award for Best Picture. So if you ever look at those lists of Best Pictures from way back, you're like, never heard of that film.
Yeah.
Well, this is one of those.
I think I've seen scenes from this one at one point in time in like film studies class, but again, I don't recognize it.
I believe it's one of our hints here in our cheat guide we're looking at, but a bunch of the music and the dance routines here have been recycled for later films, most notably Singing in the Rain, which also was a song that came out this year. One that you probably have seen before, though probably not the whole thing, The Skeleton Dance, a famous animation by Walt Disney that has become kind of a Halloween classic.
Oh, yeah.
I predict that we see a lot of the shorts from this are going to be used in the Halloween films next year.
Yeah, you're going to see, I think, a lot of use of this thing as to whatever it is. I mean, it is kind of a classic one. I mean, and it's actually, I think, one of the better kind of like early Disney movies. It's just
like if you
fun.
See a clip from it, you'll immediately recognize the footage. It's very iconic. Blackmail, an Alfred Hitchcock film, his first sound film. That's the main reason it's notable. One little trivia point. It was originally filmed as a silent movie and then later reshot. So I've never seen it, but I'm kind of curious now if it holds up.
Yeah, I've seen most of Alfred Hitchcock at some point in time, but I don't know if I wouldn't recognize this one probably specifically.
This is pretty early on, so yeah. And then a couple more here. Hallelujah, one of the first major films with an all-black cast. Which is remarkable for the 1920s and worth mentioning. The Wild Party, Clara Bow's first talking film, going over and exploring the flapper lifestyle, which was, of course, a big deal in the 1920s.
Tell you about sexual liberation again.
Yes. I remember when I took that class, they talked about the amount of fabric that was used to produce women's clothing decreased by 40%, just reflecting how much more they were liberalizing how much skin you could show in public without being yelled at. And there's some more in here. Pandora's Box, a German film. It says here it's a landmark of Weimar cinema. I've heard of this one. I don't know why I've heard of it, though. Any ideas?
There's ones in here that definitely I recognize. That's what it is. That's one of them. Again, I don't necessarily know why. It does talk about Showboat, the movie.
Showboat, a Harry Pollard film.
I think that's a major film. We sort of bumped into again. I mean, I probably own that, to be quite truthful.
Yeah, there's not, and we're kind of going through the list here, but it kind of trails off. So there's not as many sort of marquee level films. Again, I think it's probably because we're in that transition from the silent era to the talkie era.
Yeah.
And in this year, I'm sure a lot of the studios are either retooling silent films to reshoot them as, like Hitchcock did, as talkie films. I'll be curious to see if we see just an explosion over the next couple of years of iconic films.
Yeah, I think a lot of it you got to get to the iconic films, and I think a lot of it's also just because of doing the things. They've got new material coming because it's talkie. They're going to make new movies. They can make new styles.
They're probably
of movies.
also rewriting and reinvesting in things.
Yeah.
But then we also have the Depression coming, so things are about to get tough for everybody. Characters. The biggest one is Popeye by far. The first public comic strip with Popeye in it comes out this year. So it's just the same rules that with Mickey Mouse. Popeye, as he is depicted in these early comics, is public domain, but the later depictions, not necessarily. For example, the Robin Williams movie that everybody has forgotten existed.
Well, and this is one where I think, as we sort of mentioned earlier, we talked about the idea of these changing characters with Mickey Mouse. We've talked about the fact that there's some real question as to what it means for a character to change. How does a character enter the public domain? We're on the early characters. That was my mention with Maltese Falcon. I mean, Sam Spade is the character that starts the question around, character copyright. Arguably, I think, that's what it is. We're now into this. What does it mean for these characters? Who is Popeye? Mm-hmm. Who is Sam Spade? These are major characters that in some sense still exist. Popeye more than Sam Spade. I think to the comment with it is every film noir detective is Sam Spade, but none of them are called Sam Spade.
Well, here's an interesting thought exercise. So I don't know if this is true or not. Let's just assume that Popeye eating spinach isn't introduced until next year.
Yeah.
So I can go draw Popeye as he's depicted here, but if I have him just mention spinach, have I infringed the copyright? That just seems insane, doesn't it?
And I think the real thing we're going to start seeing with this, we're hitting this era now of like famous characters, and this is going to keep going. There's some very major characters coming up here in the next 10 years. Hey, we're talking at the start of DC Comics.
Mm-hmm. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, all in the next decade.
Yep, stuff like that. We're seeing major early film stars, starting to come into play. Like we mentioned early musicals, things like that. I think we're coming to a reckoning where we're going to have to really look at what does character copyright mean and what are the scope of these, because we're going to see stuff happen. It happened with Sherlock Holmes. We saw a lot of it, but a lot of the Sherlock Holmes stuff got resolved on the side because the issues were unclear. I think we're going to end up with these where they can't resolve them without the courts. We're going to have a court come in and truly say, this is what we mean. This is the evolution of a character. And we're seeing it being done purposefully now, too, because of this stuff changing.
The comic book characters might make this a lot more interesting because it's visual depiction.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to think through, is it a different issue than, say, Mickey Mouse? Because Mickey's visual depiction has changed so much. Even from 1928 until, say, 1940, it changes a lot. Does Superman look that much different?
And this is the one I think we're actually going to see. My take of where this is going to be really interesting is Superman is much more similar to the original Superman than Batman is to the original Batman. I mean, the original depiction of the Batmobile is sort of a great example because it's a fancy car. Yeah. The cars in the 1920s are kind of different. In the 1930s when it's first created. I think it's actually 1950. So I remember this is the first appearance of the Batmobile. When it is. But we've got these ideas that says, hey, some of these characters have changed radically in the course of 100 years. Some of them really haven't changed that much at all. And so what does that mean? Superman's costume has not changed very dramatically. The stylized S has been on his cape for a long time.
Yeah. But they still got trademark for that.
Yeah, there's no trademark for that. But those kind of things sort of with it. And again, we're getting into these comic book characters, these ones that are abiding, lasting. And part of it's probably just because we're talking about American literature at this stage. This is stuff that stayed in American consciousness because it's the heyday of American literature, American movie, American comics.
Yeah. Okay, music. We got a couple of things. Singing in the Rain, probably the most famous thing entering the public domain this year. And again,
not the one from the movie.
It's the composition, not the film.
It's not even the one from the movie, because remember, that's a specific arrangement technically from the movie. So.
That's true. I've got another one I wrote down here that is near and dear to me. Ain't Misbehavin'. It's a Fats Waller a jazz number. This has been covered by everybody. I made a partial list. Bing Crosby, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Dave Brubeck, Hank Williams Jr., Ray Charles, Carol Channing, Benny Goodman, Miles Davis, Nat King Cole, and Art Tatum. That's like a third of the people who covered this song. If you ever play jazz,
if you played in high school,
band,
you probably played Ain't Misbehavin'.
You eventually play an arrangement of Ain't Misbehavin'. It's just Google it. You'll recognize it immediately. It's used all the time. Some more George Gershwin, An American in Paris. Tiptoe Through the Tulips, Al Dubin. I don't know who that's by. And music by Joe Burke. Obviously, it's a song everybody knows about. And then one I thought was interesting, Happy Days Are Here Again. I don't know the song, but when I heard that, I thought that was...
You know it.
It's from FDR's presidential campaign. That was his theme during the Depression.
Yep.
Happy Days Are Here Again. So this comes out, ironically, the year the Depression begins, and is used by Roosevelt 2 years later to win the presidency.
Mm-hmm.
So there we go. There's our music. The public domain site also has artwork. Artwork is interesting because it's harder to tell usually when it enters the public domain. We have good records on when books were published because you can just find a copy of it and open to the front cover and there's the imprint and you know. Film, we usually know as well. But art, you don't always know.
We don't have good art reproduction yet.
Yes.
I mean, this is, for the most part, still hand reproduction.
Because art...
or originals.
Art by its nature is not necessarily mass reproduced, right? To consume art in this time, you would go see it in a museum somewhere, whereas to consume film... or radio or music, you broadcast it in
you
some
need
fashion.
Prints coming into play, which we've got just a little bit before we get into really good quality color prints here. Now it's coming.
It's coming,
with Warhol. But that's, I think, some of the things that we've really got into is it's hard to know where it is. I think this is also an area where it's not as important for art because most of the art we're going to be talking about at this stage is in a museum. And
it's still there, probably.
Yeah, it's still there, and they have control of the original.
Yeah. So Dolly is active at this time.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, or is he? But Dolly or
he's
I think so.
Coming, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is
Picasso
a good,
is also
Picasso. Yeah. So I'm mixing up my Spaniards. So there's a lot of art that's on the Duke domain name page, but they don't display most of it because, as you'll see there, they kind of look over when was stuff first quote unquote published, which starts the copyright term running. And the bottom line is, for the most part, we just can't tell because if there's no good contemporary records of a newspaper article saying, I just saw it in the museum, then we just don't know.
And it's also some of this is just 100 years ago we weren't paying more attention to it.
Yeah, nobody cared.
And now we are, so it's one of those things we know when stuff's published for our work, but back then we didn't.
Well, the copyright term was different back then too. There was registration requirements that were all eliminated in the 1970s, so it wasn't as big of a deal. We should note also that one of the concerns with the public domain is that these older works are getting lost. We have things that have been produced. We talked about the original film production of The Great Gatsby has been completely lost. No copies of it exist. And there's an argument that there is a legitimate fair use archival interest in preserving these things, but that requires that you get a copy of it, which is tough to do when you don't have control over it. So, I'm a pack rat by nature, so everything I produce will be around somewhere forever. None of it's worth anything.
Unless, it happens to be destroyed somewhere along the way unintentionally and everything else. But
yeah, so interesting times we live in as these works continue to show up and become available for everybody to use. I think we can expect a bunch of weird Popeye horror this year. Maybe a Popeye, Mickey, Winnie the Pooh horror crossover.
Well, I know there is I'm trying to think what they're calling it. There is something where they've made the whatever verse of all the horror movies, of all these essentially beloved childhood characters entering their horror movie debuts. I think the real thing is, as much as we look at it and say that's kind of silly as to whatever it is, it's also what's supposed to happen. Yeah. And again, I talk about it every year. We sort of say it as so I think a lot of people think it's interesting that us as, people who work in intellectual property and the protecting of IP all the time think Public Domain Day is such a big deal. But part of it is because it's all for a limited time. That's the whole idea. These things are supposed to go forward, and they're supposed to eventually enter the public domain. And part of the reason they enter the public domain is so new stuff gets created. And we have seen an explosion of that this last year. Now, you can say it's mediocre content, it's childish, it's dumb, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's new content, and that's what this is supposed to do, is create new content.
And we were talking at lunch today about how a lot of works that wind up being iconic and wind up being the things that later generations study and read in school are not appreciated in their own time.
Yeah.
Like The Great Gatsby is an example of that.
Well, yeah, and I even said in the introduction, Shakespeare was, designed for the masses. It was not designed to be great literature.
Yeah, Shakespeare was the toilet humor of his day.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so that's all for Public Domain Day this year. Next up, we are going to do our Star Wars episode. So make sure you come back and stay tuned for that. We're doing a 2-for-1 to make sure we get some content out of here
exactly.
early in 2025. So that's all for this time. We'll see you next time. Lauren, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded in St. Louis, Missouri.